Hello class, and welcome to week 11 of Sound Bites. This week we are going to be looking at the genres of hip-hop, rap, and gangsta rap. Now, for students in the past in this course, this has sometimes been surprising that we're covering hip-hop in a course that is about the history and styles of rock music. However, as I've mentioned in past Soundbites videos and in the introduction, I'm not considering this as simply just a history of what would be narrowly construed as rock music, but really a big umbrella spanning potentially all of American popular music and British and from other countries as well, popular music as a whole. So for me, it's essential to understand the origins and the emergence of hip-hop and rap in order to actually understand the trajectory that rock music itself has taken, especially when we get into the present in the 2000s and the 2010s. And so again, I'm not saying here by covering hip-hop and rap music that it is a type or subgenre of rock music, although I'm also not saying that. What I am saying is I think in this big umbrella, studying rock music and its interaction with various musical others, that we can best get the fullest picture of rock music and these styles and traditions by looking at how it interacts with these various musical genres. You may remember in the past that rock music interacted with rhythm and blues, with country, with metal, with soul, and with funk, and all these in some ways by being defined against rock. Disco as well is another common example. By being defined as against rock, that also helps to throw rock itself in starker relief, what is being considered as rock, such as what we looked at last week when talking about classic rock. Okay, so with that disclaimer out of the way, let's go ahead and begin the Soundbites video. Alright. So according to Greg Kot of the Chicago Tribune, gangsta rap, especially NWA's album Straight Outta Compton, forced America to confront the issues in its ghettos, and its realities were shocking when presented so explicitly on a recording that white suburban teenagers coveted. Alright, there's a lot here to unpack, but essentially what we can see here is that music served as a vehicle to communicate something about the lived experience of black communities, particularly in the impoverished urban Southwest. And those realities, entering into listening communities that were very much unlike the ones that produced it, were shocking to many listeners, and either reacted with outrage, with backlash, with censorship, or with fascination and wanting to learn more about the situation and lifestyle. Alright, second quote to get us started. This is from the lyrics of Public Enemy's song Fight the Power, which sort of serves as an anthem almost of the type of music that we're discussing this week. Our freedom of speech is freedom or death. We got to fight the powers that be. Let me hear you say, fight the power. And so this, spoken from the communities that are producing this music, I really love this line of, our freedom of speech is freedom or death. So in a way, music is serving as a channel to carry out the voices and the freedom of speech of this community that often felt like that voice was being stripped away from them. Remember in the past of this course, in past weeks, we've talked before about how music always represents a community, is always emblematic of a specific type of people. Music is never heard just in a vacuum. And so hearing this music of hip-hop, rap, and gangster rap, this music would represent to its hearers, especially at the time, very specific communities and a different perspective on looking at the world. So with that, let's begin. For hip-hop and rap, we're going to be talking about three artists focusing on. First is Grandmaster Flash, one of the great early pioneers of hip-hop. Then we'll look at the rap group Public Enemy. And then finally, the group that in a lot of ways kicked off what is known as gangsta rap, NWA, which is an acronym that if you're curious about, you can look up. So let's talk about the origins of hip-hop. Now, hip-hop represents more than just a musical style, which might surprise some of us that mainly associate the term with music. Rather, it was a whole cultural movement coming out of urban black communities, especially in early 1970s New York City in the Bronx borough, in these block parties, which would basically be music and dance parties put on by DJs, usually in residential or storefronts. Now, the 1980s, which is the decade that we're now entering into in our course, is considered the golden age of at least this first wave of hip hop. I know now today, as we'll talk about later, it really has a new dominance, but for this initial wave and then the backlash that follows it, the 80s is really the time of golden age of developing hip hop. Now, for influences into this genre, they drew a lot of influences on the mobile sound systems of Jamaican ska. Remember all the way back to the beginning of the course that we talked about, in Jamaica, DJs would put on these speakers and turntables and like onto these trucks and drive around to be able to take the music to the community, to the listeners. And very similarly with hip-hop, except in this case, maybe instead of being loaded up on trucks, they could be deployed in a house, in a storefront, just taking music to the people. The 4 pillars of hip-hop culture as developed during this time are DJing or turntabling. This is referring to actually putting the records on and selecting them for play, as well as the various techniques used to spin one into another or combine the two or create scratches to create more sound effects. MCing or rapping, this is the vocal component, so what you say to the people at the block party while the record is playing, and how that often took on rhymed and rhythmic components that would birth the idea of rap. Then for dancing, there is the b-boying, which is break boy, or breakdancing is what we tend to know it as. So during these percussive breaks within the song, when the lyrics would go away and it would just be mostly percussion, very heavily percussion and drum driven, this is the part where the block party, a lot of people who were maybe just sitting on the walls and waiting for their time to jump in would come forth and join the floor and do all sorts of moves that we would now consider as breakdancing, part of that tradition. And finally, the 4th pillar is graffiti art, which I think we are also familiar with. Hip-hop has a so-called holy trinity of these early figures who really did a lot to develop the genre. There was DJ Kool Herc, African Bambaataa, and Grandmaster Flash, who we'll be talking about shortly. But first, to talk about Kool Herc. In 1973, DJ Kool Herc, who was an immigrant from Jamaica and therefore carried this influence from the ska and sound system movement into the New York Bronx, he hosted this block party Back to School Jam. And this was one of the most well-known block parties that happened during this period. At this block party, he introduced the breakbeat technique, or also known as the merry-go-round technique. What this is a way of using 2 turntables, each with a record, and usually he would actually use 2 copies of the same record. Now, why would he do that? Well, if you did that, then you are now able to extend that dance break when it was the point of highest engagement, when all the b-boys and b-girls would jump off the wall and come and dance and do their moves. He could take that break, which was normally short, to get back to the vocal part. He could then extend it endlessly, potentially, by going from the break section on one record, and when that ends, he would fade to the other turntable and have it queued up for the start of the break on that record. So you go from, let's just say, 16 bars of a break on record 1. At the end of that, 16 bars of the break on record 2. In the meantime, reverse record 1 back to the start of the break, and that's how you could get an endless break. So just keep the energy high and keep the people dancing. Now, also very influential to early hip-hop was the TR-808 drum machine. Even if you aren't familiar with this device, you've definitely heard its sounds. Its sounds have made its way, continue to be passed down through hip-hop all the way into contemporary tracks, like the sound of the clap, the snare, the hi-hat, the bass drum. They're sounds that don't quite sound real, but that's part of their charm, and they get reused because they sound somewhat synthetic and are easily sampled and carried on into the future. Speaking of sampling, sampler machines are also highly influential to the sound of hip-hop. Now, one of your videos in the materials speaks to this, but it was very common to take existing parts of tracks, especially those percussive breaks, and use them as the basis for a new hip-hop or rap track. And again, this process continues to this day. And so sampler machines were devices that helped people to do that. They could capture sound as short as a single snare drum or a single hi-hat, or as long as a passage of a piece, and then play it back when you hit the button. But now we should also talk about the origins of rap, which in some ways are distinct from hip-hop in general. There's this quote that I found in the source that says, "Rap is something you do, like an action, and a part of hip-hop. Hip hop is something you live, a larger cultural movement, as we've established. So rapping, in a sense, is an important component of hip hop culture, although musically, hip hop and rap should still be distinguished. The two are not always completely overlapped. Now, the Black Arts movement in the 1960s to 70s, especially in these boroughs of New York like Bronx or Harlem, helped to lay the foundation for hip hop and rap to emerge. DJ Kool Herc, who we mentioned earlier, was also working on pioneering this rhyming rhythmic emceeing over the instrumental breaks while he played. But one of the main influences for rap actually comes not from a musician like Kool Herc, but from a poet, Amiri Baraka. He was a poet in this Black Arts movement whose rhythmic flow when he was delivering his poetry, he would select words more for their sound and for their rhythm as much as for their meaning, treating it in a musical or at least a rhythmic manner. And so Amiri Baraka's works constituted a strong rejection of the so-called poetic voice, which was developed from European poetry. This is things like, reading poetry very stoically, very fluidly, and sort of without emotion or inflection. For an example, two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both, and be one traveler, long I stood, and so on and so forth. So that's an example of the poet voice, which if you look up Amiri Baraka's performances, he really strongly rejects. So, for example, Baraka's poem Dope, which I encourage you to look up a performance of, combines this rapid rhythmic delivery, really carrying the rhythm of music. Dun 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 dun, things like that sort of we're familiar with from the rhythms of rap, as well as expressive vocalizations from like hoops and hollering from the gospel tradition to just expressing the words in with much more emotion and depth of feeling than the typical poet voice. Now, Baraka was also keenly attuned to music's power, and he frequently used music as a political tool, as what he would call a political weapon, in order to help bring his points across. So he viewed music as an important part of culture. And oftentimes he would read his poetic creations in the style that he did to music, whether it be with a jazz combo or accompanied by a saxophone, sort of have this musical interplay where his words were part of the musical texture and fabric itself. So in that way, I think that served to lay the foundation for what we now know as rap today. But let's go ahead and go back to looking at hip-hop and talk about Grandmaster Flash. So Grandmaster Flash's true name is Joseph Sadler, and he grew up in poverty in Bronx. But even from an early age, he was going to junkyards, going to used hardware stores, taking radios or cassette players, and just trying to pull them apart to see what made them tick, and then put them back together again. So with this knowledge, he was able to build his own sound system that he could then use for DJing. Sound systems such as speakers and turntables, and that was his early tools early on in his career. Now, his career got off to a rough start, but with dedication, he just kept improving, and by 1976, he was playing to a sold-out show of 3,000 in Harlem. Now, that may not sound like a lot by today's or by rock music standards, but again, this is in a block party, so imagine 3,000 people crammed into a parking lot, into a storefront, etc. Now, Grandmaster Flash claimed to be the first to implement the sound of DJ scratching in tracks, getting that sound of the needle scratching over the vinyl and using that in a musical way as part of the piece itself. If you listen to his song The Wheels of Steel, which we'll talk about in just a bit, he prominently uses the scratching as part of the musical texture. And he also realized that having his direct hand contact on the record allowed him to get more seamless transitions between songs than simply letting it spin at the rate of the needle. Now, I mentioned Grandmaster Flash's track The Wheels of Steel, which I've included in the Spotify playlist, and I just think is an incredible achievement and a testament to the aesthetic values of early hip-hop. This is a phenomenal track that was performed in one take, using only 2 turntables. Now, I know that I said that was standard, but this is important because of the number of tracks that he's going to involve. So with those 2 turntables, he then combines 10 different songs into one meaningful whole. So, for example, he finds tracks that reinforce each other, being in like the same key or the same general tempo, and have grooves that are similar so that you can hear them at once. He has sometimes when he will cut back from one to another in order to create a kind of dialogue and commentary. And he has tracks that are similar to each other so that when it returns later on in the piece, you feel like it's the same track, but it actually turns out to be a different track. So all these different ways he's thoughtfully overlaying and putting these different tracks into dialogue with each other, and basically a really artistic mashup. Not just to be, oh, I like this song and then here's the next song, but to create an overarching narrative and flow throughout the piece. So definitely listen to that one in its entirety. I put a link to a visual diagram of it in your later materials. Now, this track by Grandmaster Flash and others like it were pioneers in the practice of sampling, which continues to be foundational to hip-hop today. So when you hear, for example, taking just a bass groove or just a drum line or something like that from a particular track and using it in the context of another track, a lot of that started here in this track with Grandmaster Flash. And in fact, many tracks that Flash samples, in this track especially, as well as others, have become classic samples that get reused over and over again in hip-hop, even to this day. But now let's go on to talk about Public Enemy. So Public Enemy I'm aligning more with rap, although, as I hope the past slides have shown, it's very difficult to pull apart hip-hop and rap entirely. But they were certainly known for their rapping over these hip-hop beats and tracks. So they're known as one of the most influential early rap groups, consisting of Chuck D and Flavor Flav as their main rappers. Now, their debut track, Public Enemy No. 1, was very influential and successful, making a big splash, and so they immediately got signed by the label Def Jam, which is a hip-hop and rap producing label. In 1987, they released their album Yo, Bum Rush the Show, which started to steer hip-hop and rap more specifically towards a tradition of political activism, which is an association it still has to this day. Now, this association was reinforced all the more in 1988 with the song that they're best known for, Fight the Power. So this references the pervasive power of black influences in music, like we've talked about all throughout this course, in ways that musicians such as Elvis Presley have actually capitalized on the music of black communities for their own gain. And then many other verses of the rap contain scathing critiques of systemic racism in the country, whether it be redlining or whether it be police brutality and the prison system, etc. Now, this track, Fight the Power, was featured on the director Spike Lee's video called Do the Right Thing, and it continues to have influence and legacy throughout modern protests, including the 2020 racial reckoning after the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery. Now, in the 1990s, later on in their career, Public Enemy was also known for supporting the open sharing of MP3 files, such as of their music and others, in order to decentralize record labels. So in my other course, the history of recorded music, I often talk about how the MP3 sharing and piracy and Napster was detrimental to the music industry, which it was. But from Public Enemy's view, they actually saw this as an opportunity to decentralize the power that record labels and studio producers had over the industry, to give them an alternative to get their music out there and get it known. In other words, it circumvents the usual channels of gatekeeping that would be established within the industry. And then we have NWA, an artist and an album straight out of Compton that your long article reading for this week will focus on. In 1988, their album Straight Outta Compton was depicting a stark look at the realities of urban Los Angeles, specifically in the Compton area. The area had been really scarred by redlining, which is racial discrimination and unequal access in housing. And a general economic recession had led to unemployment, widespread unemployment as high as 50%, and gang warfare and territory warfare in the streets. Now, within this context, NWA produced the track F the Police, which depicts an uncompromising picture of what life for black men in LA was like under the constant fear and threat of police surveillance and brutality. If you go and listen to this track and others on the album as well, you'll just hear the rage and the despair and also the fear that is generated out of this reality. The idea that, for example, seeing a police officer means potentially fearing for your life, being taken or permanently incarcerated, rather than a sense of safety or a sense of security, as many people might associate. I think these conversations are still very relevant even to the present day. Now moving on, Straight Outta Compton became one of the first records ever to receive the Parental Advisory label from the Parents Music Resource Center, which was founded and headed by Mary Gore, the wife of the Senator Al Gore. Now it also became the subject of a Senate hearing along with other rap and hip-hop records to sort of scrutinize the message, and ultimately this sort of crescendoed and culminated into the FBI Assistant Director Milt Ehrlich, who was pressuring their label to withdraw the record. He wrote with the weight of the FBI behind him saying, "We do not approve of this record, it condones violence against police," and go on and on. You can see that letter if you look it up. And this continued to culminate and peaked when NWA was performing this album in concert in Detroit. At one point, police who had gathered there rushed on stage to disrupt the song and chase the artists away. So that was an example of sort of the fever pitch that this backlash rose to. Now you'll read more about this article and about the group NWA in the reading, and especially if you listen to the long interview that's optional. NWA saw controversy as a weapon to be used, much like Amiri Baraka did. As was their music. They wanted to use music as a vehicle to help shed light on the harsh reality of life, especially that they experience as black men in LA. One of the articles that I referenced for this, the Washington Post article, says, "Sometimes to get the world to listen, you need to be explicit." And so again, just to review sort of what we've traversed so far, remember that there is no musical style, no musical genre that is in a vacuum. Musical style is always emblematic or representative of some people group, some community, or maybe the perception of that community. And also, in this case, music can be a vehicle for social change and protest. We saw that back in the 60s, and that's what many of these hip-hop and rap artists, such as Public Enemy and NWA, were doing through their music. And so, personally, as a composer and a music theorist, I find that fascinating. That's going to go ahead and bring us to the end of this week's Soundbites video, and I hope it's set you up well to engage with the materials around hip-hop rap and gangster rap, and specifically Straight Outta Compton, in the remainder of this week's materials.